Rain hammers a rusted shipping container. Inside, Jaewon finds a gold school award medal crushed under a heavy boot. Chairman Kang-Dae smiles, holding a blowtorch to a stack of port permits. Why is a billionaire terrified of a simple history teacher? Some build power with money. Others build it with fear. I am Alfred. I tell stories of the shadows, the streets, the silence, and the wars, where influence is stronger than weapons. Subscribe and walk with me. The Busan International Terminal is a maze of steel. Here, Chairman Kang-Dae Oh rules the supply chain. He controls every crate that enters the country. To him, the law is just a suggestion. Seok stands in a cold office on the top floor. She sees the harbor lights below. Beside her, young Hana is shivering. Kang-Dae holds a digital tablet. It shows a debt of $5 million owed by Hana's father. He tells Jaewon that the girl is now lost cargo. Jaewon does not scream. She looks at the maritime maps on the wall. She knows these routes better than his captains do. She tells him that if he moves one more crate, his entire company will vanish by morning. The guards laugh, but Kang-Dae sees something in her eyes. It is not fear. It is a calculated plan. The stakes are no longer just a debt. It is the survival of an empire. The colorful banners of the hand-bit high school festival danced in the wind, but Seok could only focus on the heavy silence of the girl sitting beside her. Hana was usually the brightest student in history class, but today her hands shook as she clutched a gold school award medal. Before Jaewon could ask what was wrong, the happy music of the festival was drowned out by the screech of tires. A black sedan tore through the school gates, scattering terrified students. Two men in sharp, dark suits stepped out with a cold efficiency that didn't belong at a carnival. They didn't speak. They didn't shout. They simply grabbed Hana by the arms. Jaewon lunged forward, catching Hana's hand, but the men were like stone. One of them pushed Jaewon back with a single, effortless hand, sending her sprawling onto the pavement. By the time Jaewon scrambled up, the car was speeding away, leaving behind nothing but the smell of burnt rubber and Hana's dropped metal. Jaewon didn't call the police. She knew that in this part of the city, the police were often just spectators to the Oseong logistics empire. She threw herself into her modest car and followed the sedan, keeping just enough distance to remain unseen. The chase led her far from the bright school lights and deep into the Busan International Terminal. The air here turned cold and smelled of salt and rusted iron. The sedan pulled up to a massive steel gate marked Private Terminal 7. This wasn't a normal port. It was a fortress of industry. Jaewon watched from the shadows as the sedan passed through. The security protocols were terrifyingly advanced. Automated cameras tracked every movement, and thermal scanners glowed red as they swept over the vehicle. This was a private kingdom where the government had no eyes. Jaewon realized she couldn't drive through. She parked and found a gap in the perimeter fence, slipping into a world of towering shipping containers that looked like giant, colorful coffins. She followed the sound of the sedan's engine until she reached a clearing beneath a circle of harsh floodlights. There stood Chairman Kang-Dae Oh. He didn't look like a gangster, he looked like a king. He stood next to the open door of the sedan, looking down at Hana as if she were a broken piece of equipment. When Jaewon stepped into the light, her heart hammering against her ribs, Kang-Dae didn't look surprised. He simply checked his watch. The way he stood, calm, wealthy, and surrounded by men who looked like weapons, showed he held all the power. To him, Jaewon wasn't a threat. She was just more inventory that had arrived at his docks. Rain slicked the pavement as Kang-Dae walked toward Jaewon, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the wet asphalt. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, like a man explaining basic math to a child. Behind him, Hana was being pushed into a cold, metal shipping container. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, but Kang-Dae didn't even glance her way. "You see these boxes, Teacher Seok?" Kang-Dae asked, waving a hand at the thousands of steel containers stacked around them. "To the world they are full of electronics or car parts, but to me they are ghosts." He leaned against the hood of his black sedan and lit a cigarette. He explained that many of these containers were marked as lost at sea before they even left the dock. By reporting them as accidents, he claimed millions in insurance money. This ghost cash was what he used to buy the loyalty of politicians and judges. To him, the shipping terminal was just a giant machine for printing untraceable money. Jaewon stood her ground, her eyes moving from the chairman to the digital manifest screen glowing on a nearby security pillar. She remembered the history of these waters, the way the moon pulled the sea in and out of the harbor. "You think you are a genius," she said, her voice steady despite the rain. "But you are making a mistake that even a first-year student would catch." Kang-Dae laughed, a short, dry sound. "A teacher is going to tell me how to run a port." Jaewon walked closer to the screen, pointing at a list of containers marked as lost during the last storm. "Your records say 3 ships lost cargo on the 14th of the month. You claim the waves were 10 meters high." She looked him directly in the eye. "But that was a neap tide. The water in this bay is at its lowest and calmest during that cycle. It is physically impossible for those ships to have swayed enough to drop a single crate, let alone 50. The smile vanished from Kang-Dae's face. The men behind him stopped laughing. Jaewon's knowledge of the natural world had just found a hole in his perfect financial lie. If an insurance auditor saw those dates matched against the tide charts, his entire political fund would be flagged for fraud. "I don't just teach dates and names, Chairman," Jaewon whispered. "I teach patterns, and yours don't match the earth." For the first time, the man who owned the empire looked at the quiet school teacher and saw a threat. Kang-Dae took a slow, deliberate step toward Jaewon, the glowing tip of his cigarette cutting through the dark rain. The silence in the terminal was heavy. His men, who had been relaxed and mocking just moments ago, now stood perfectly still. Jaewon's words about the tide patterns hadn't just insulted him. They had exposed a structural weakness in his billion-dollar fraud. "You have a very dangerous tongue for a teacher," Kang-Dae said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. He signaled to one of his guards who moved toward Hana's container. "Logic won't save that girl, and it won't save you. In this port. My word is the only law that matters. Why should I care about the tides when I own the people who read the charts?" Jaewon didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, weathered fountain pen. It was a simple object, but the moment Kang-Dae saw the silver crest on the cap, his eyes widened. He recognized the mark. It belonged to a man known only as the Old Man, a retired legend who had built the very foundations of the city's underground economy before Kang-Dae was even born. "You recognize this because you still pay him a tribute every month," Jaewon said calmly. "I wasn't just his tutor. I am the only person he trusts to manage his private ledger. Every offshore account, every hidden vault, and every name on his payroll is locked in my head." She stepped closer, her silhouette sharp against the car's headlights. "The Old Man hates messy business. If he finds out you are kidnapping children and drawing heat to his docks with sloppy insurance scams, he won't just take your permits. He will erase your name from the industry." The power in the clearing shifted instantly. Kang-Dae was no longer looking at a helpless woman. He was looking at the gatekeeper to a power much larger than his own. He knew that killing her would bring the Old Man's wrath, but letting her go meant she held the leash to his empire. Hana watched from the steel container, sensing the change in the air. The billionaire was no longer the hunter. For the first time, he was the prey. Kang-Dae stared at the fountain pen, his mind racing to calculate the risk. He waved his hand and his guards stepped back, though they kept their weapons ready. He gestured for his legal strategist, Director Min, to come forward. Min was a man who lived in the world of fine print and digital shadows. He looked at Jaewon with a mixture of curiosity and cold calculation. "The chairman does not like threats, teacher," Director Min said, adjusting his glasses. "But he respects assets. If you truly have access to the Old Man's ledger, prove it. Log into the secure shipping portal and authorize the release of the ghost containers from the last neap tide. Do that, and the girl goes home." Jaewon knew this was a trap. If she logged in, they would trace her location and identity instantly. But she also knew how their system worked. She stepped toward Min's laptop, which was connected to the terminal's internal network. "I will send a verification packet," she said. "It is the only way the old man's system will recognize this port's server." She typed a series of complex commands. To Min, it looked like a high-level security handshake between two criminal databases. In reality, Jaewon was using a Trojan horse technique. The email she was drafting looked like a private authorization to Director Min, but hidden within the encrypted header was a whistleblower trigger. The moment Min clicked send to verify the packet, the data wouldn't go to a secret vault. It would go directly to the National Port Authority's Emergency Audit Department. "There," Jaewon said, stepping back. "Send it and the path clears." Min, eager to gain control of the legendary ledger, clicked the button. A small green bar moved across the screen. He didn't realize he had just invited the government into his boss's private books. However, the victory came with a price. Jae, a young dockworker who had been secretly signaling Jaewon from the shadows and helping her navigate the terminal, was spotted by a security camera near the laptop station. Kang-Dae didn't wait for an explanation. He snapped his fingers and two guards grabbed Jae. "This boy was your eyes on my docks, wasn't he?" Kang-Dae sneered. He didn't hurt Jae physically, which was worse. He took Jae's worker ID and snapped it in half. "You are fired, and I've just sent your face to every port in the country. You will never find a job on the water again. Your career is dead because of a history teacher." Jae looked at Jaewon, his face pale and full of betrayal. Jaewon felt a sharp pang of guilt. To save the girl and break the empire, she had to let an innocent man's life be ruined. The audit was coming, but the cost was already starting to pile up. The sirens of the terminal's main gate suddenly began to wail, a sharp, mechanical scream that cut through the rain. On the security pillar, the monitor screen flashed bright red. "Notice of Systemic Audit," the text read in bold, white letters. Underneath, a timer appeared. 60 minutes to total asset freeze. Director Min's face went gray. He frantically tapped at the keyboard, but the Trojan horse Jaewon had planted had already locked the administrative controls. Every ship in the Ocean Fleet, vessels currently crossing the Pacific, docking in Singapore, or waiting just outside the harbor, received the same emergency signal. Their digital docking permits were being revoked in real time. "What have you done?" Kang-Dae roared, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and genuine fear. "I didn't do anything," Jaewon replied, her voice remaining low and steady. "Director Min sent the email. He just reported his own chairman for maritime insurance inconsistencies." The market freeze was a specialized legal mechanism designed to stop financial flight. Because the audit was flagged as high-risk fraud, the National Port Authority had the power to stop all movement. For Kang-Dae, this was a catastrophe. In the world of logistics, time is literally money. His contracts had just-in-time clauses. If his ships didn't move, he faced penalties of hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. Kang-Dae grabbed his phone, but his calls were going straight to voicemail. His political allies were already distancing themselves. No one wanted to be connected to a company under a code red federal investigation. The billionaire stood in the middle of his empire, but he was suddenly powerless. He couldn't sell his stock, he couldn't move his ships, and he couldn't pay his men. He looked at Jaewon, then at the shipping container where Hana was held. "You think this wins?" he hissed. "I still have the girl. If I'm going down, I'll make sure there's nothing left for you to save." But Jaewon knew the philosophy of men like Kang-Dae. They only valued what they could own. "You don't understand," she said. "The auditors are already at the front gate. If they find a kidnapped student here, you won't just lose your money. You'll lose your life in a prison cell. Is she worth that much to you?" The power had moved entirely. Kang-Dae was no longer a king. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, watching his billions evaporate with every tick of the audit clock. Kang-Dae walked toward the shipping container where Hana was held, his steps heavy with a desperate kind of arrogance. He reached out and touched the rusted steel wall, his fingers tracing the rivets as if he were feeling the heartbeat of his empire. The audit sirens continued to scream in the background, but he seemed to tune them out. "You think you've won because you stopped my ships, Jaewon?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly calm. "You think the law is a shield? Let me tell you how the world actually works. Everything you see, the cranes, the ships, even the air you are breathing right now, has a price tag. Power isn't about following rules. Power is the ability to decide who is a human being and who is just a product." He turned to look at her, his eyes cold and hollow. He explained that in his world, a person like Hana was no different than a crate of electronics. If she brought in money, she was valuable. If she caused a loss, she was rust to be scraped away. He told Jaewon that by interfering, she hadn't saved a soul. She had simply changed the girl's status from an asset to a liability. "The system doesn't care about your history lessons or your moral heart," Kang-Dae sneered. "It only cares about the balance sheet. When the auditors leave, I will still have the warehouses. I will still have the docks. But you will just be the woman who let a student get caught in the gears because you wanted to play hero." Jaewon watched him, realizing that Kang-Dae didn't just commit crimes. He truly believed that empathy was a mechanical error. He saw the entire world as a warehouse, and anyone who wasn't owning the shelves was just an item to be moved or discarded. "You're wrong, Chairman," Jaewon said softly. "A product doesn't fight back. A product doesn't have a memory, but people do, and memories are the only things that don't have a price tag." The psychological pressure was thick. Kang-Dae was trying to make her feel small, to make her believe her efforts were meaningless against his massive wealth. Jaewon felt the weight of his words, wondering if she really was just putting Hana in more danger. But she looked at the old man's pen in her hand and remembered that even the biggest empires are built on secrets that can be whispered away. A heavy thud echoed through the terminal as Director Min dropped a thick, leather-bound folder onto the hood of the sedan. "The audit team is 5 minutes from the gate, Chairman," he said, his voice trembling. He looked at Jaewon. "We can still stop this. I have a backdoor link to the Port Authority's server. If you give us the old man's decryption key, I can wipe the ghost container logs before they see them. But you have to do it now." Kang-Dae grabbed Hana by the shoulder and pulled her out of the container. The girl was sobbing, her school uniform stained with grease and rain. He held a heavy master key to the terminal's locks in one hand and his phone in the other. "Here is the deal, teacher. Give Min the key and I walk this girl to the front gate myself. She goes home and this whole night becomes a bad dream. Refuse, and I let the audit happen. I'll lose my money, but I'll make sure the girl stays locked in a container that's scheduled for a one-way trip to a scrapyard in a country you can't find on a map." Jaewon looked at Hana's tear-filled eyes. Every maternal instinct told her to save the child immediately, but she looked at the audit timer on the screen. If she gave them the key, the corruption would continue. More students like Hana would be snatched. More dockworkers like Jae would be ruined. The old man's secrets would be used to build an even bigger cage. "No," Jaewon said, her voice cracking but firm. Hana let out a small cry of disbelief. Even Kang-Dae looked shocked. For a moment, Jaewon looked like the villain. She was choosing the systemic collapse of a corporation over the immediate safety of a terrified teenager. "You're choosing the paperwork," Kang-Dae hissed, his face twisting in rage. "You're going to let her disappear just to win a legal argument." "I'm choosing to end you," Jaewon replied. She felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest, knowing she was gambling with a life she was supposed to protect. "If I save her your way, you keep the power to do this again tomorrow. I won't let there be a tomorrow for you." She turned her back on Hana's cries and walked toward the security pillar, watching the audit progress bar hit 95%. She was reducing her own soul to a calculation, hoping her strategic gamble would pay off before the last door closed. Director Min watched the audit bar climb toward the finish line. He could hear the heavy rumble of government SUVs arriving at the main gate. He looked at Kang-Dae, who was shouting into a dead phone, and then at Jae-won, who stood like a statue. Min was a man of logic and survival. He knew that when an empire falls, the smart rats jump first. While Kang-Dae was distracted by his own rage, Min stepped away from the sedan and slipped into the shadows of a nearby control booth. He pulled out a private encrypted tablet, one that wasn't linked to the terminal's main server. He didn't call the police. He called the Oseong Logistics Board of Directors. "The chairman is compromised," Min whispered into the headset. "The federal audit is live. By morning, every stock you own will be worth zero if he is still in charge." Min wasn't acting out of kindness for Jae-won or Hana. He was executing a boardroom coup. He explained to the directors that Kang-Dae had violated his fiduciary duty by using company assets for kidnapping and personal insurance fraud. Under the company's emergency bylaws, a 2/3 vote could strip the chairman of all executive power immediately to protect the shareholders. Within minutes, the board members, terrified of losing their fortunes, sent a digital cease and desist order to Kang-Dae's own device. Min stepped back into the light, holding his tablet up so Kang-Dae could see it. "It's over, Kang-Dae. The board has removed you. You no longer own this terminal. You don't even own the car you're leaning on." Kang-Dae stared at the screen, his face twitching. He looked at the guards, but they were already looking at Min. They worked for the paycheck, not the man. When the money stopped, their loyalty evaporated. "I built this," Kang-Dae screamed, but his voice sounded thin against the wind. Min ignored him and looked at Jae-won. "Teacher, I've saved the company's value. Now give me the location of the old man's assets, and I'll make sure the girl walks out of here." Jae-won saw the shift in power. One monster was being replaced by a more polite one. She knew that to truly end the cycle, she couldn't just stop at Kang-Dae. She had to use the final piece of the old man's puzzle. Jae-won ignored Director Min's offer. She didn't trust a man who traded loyalty for stock prices. Instead, she looked back at the security monitor. The tide was reaching its lowest point, and the moonlight hit the water at a specific angle, reflecting off a row of containers stacked near the very edge of the pier. She remembered the old man's riddle from years ago. The greatest secrets are kept where the sea meets the iron, hidden by the moon's own hand. She walked toward container 1M2345. It was a dull, gray box that looked exactly like the thousands of others around it. While Kang-Dae screamed at his guards to protect him from the approaching federal vehicles, Jae-won used the heavy master key she had snatched from the sedan's console during the chaos. The heavy steel doors groaned as she pulled them open. Inside, there were no electronics or luxury cars. Instead, the container was lined with floor-to-ceiling filing cabinets and cold storage servers. This was the physical black box of the Oseong Empire. It held the original, unedited shipping manifests that proved the insurance fraud wasn't just a mistake, it was a decade-long conspiracy. Tucked into a small velvet box on the desk inside was a final piece of evidence. A collection of hard drives containing the recorded conversations between Kang-Dae and the corrupt officials who allowed his lost containers to pass. "It's all here," Jae-won whispered. She grabbed the drives, her hands trembling. She turned around to find Hana standing at the edge of the container. The girl had escaped during the confusion of the boardroom coup. Jae-won pulled the girl inside, shielding her from the flashing lights of the police cars now breaking through the terminal gates. "I'm sorry I made you wait," Jae-won said, holding Hana close. "But now they can never take you or anyone else again." Jae-won looked out at the pier. The audit was complete. The old man's secret was now a weapon for justice. The physical proof was in her hands, and the empire of rust was finally ready to sink. The blue and red lights of the federal vehicles flooded the terminal, reflecting off the wet shipping containers like a cold neon sea. Chairman Kang-Dae Oh stood frozen as dozens of officers poured out of the SUVs. He looked at Director Min, then at the open container full of his secrets, and finally at Jaewon. The man who had once viewed people as inventory was now being surrounded like a piece of faulty machinery marked for disposal. Federal agents moved in with an efficiency that even Kang-Dae couldn't buy. They didn't just arrest him. They seized his servers, his private ledgers, and the hard drives Jaewon held tightly in her hands. The anchor had officially dropped, because the evidence was found in a container marked as lost for insurance purposes. The legal trap was inescapable. Every bribe, every fake accident, and every life he had stepped on was now a permanent part of the public record. As Kang-Dae was being led away in handcuffs, he stopped for a moment in front of Jaewon. His expensive suit was soaked, and his eyes were hollow. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his freedom. He looked at the girl, Hana, who was now safely wrapped in a police blanket. "You destroyed $1 billion legacy for one student," he hissed, his voice trembling. "I didn't destroy it," Jaewon replied, her voice calm and clear. "I just taught it a lesson in accountability. Some things simply aren't for sale." The justice was absolute. Within days, the Oseong logistics empire was dismantled. The board of directors was purged, and the company's massive profits were frozen to pay back the insurance companies and create a trust fund for victims of maritime exploitation. The port itself underwent a total systemic change, moving to a transparent digital tracking system that no single man could manipulate. But the cost was real. Jaewon could no longer walk the halls of her school as a simple history teacher. Her name was now linked to the old man, and the shadows of the underworld would always be watching her. She stood on the pier one last time, looking at the gold school award medal Hana had returned to her. It was polished and bright, no longer crushed by a billionaire's boot. To the audience of Alfred Mafia stories, the story of Jaewon Seok and the Oseong Empire isn't just about the fall of a criminal. It's a masterclass in how power actually functions in the real world. As you walk away from this chapter, keep these 3 lessons in mind. 1. The currency of information overrides force. Chairman Kang-Dae believed that physical dominance, kidnapping, intimidation, and control was the ultimate power. He was wrong. Jaewon proved that information is the only asset that cannot be seized. By understanding the tide charts and the internal manifest systems, she made his billions look like play money. The lesson: if you want to defeat a giant, don't aim for their muscle, aim for their logic. Find the internal flaw in their system that they assume no one else is smart enough to notice. 2. The Trojan horse of bureaucracy. Most people view laws and regulations as annoying obstacles. In this story, they became the ultimate weapon. Jaewon didn't use a gun to dismantle an empire. She used an audit. She turned the bureaucracy of the Port Authority into a guillotine for the Oseong fleet. The lesson: every system, whether it's a business, a government, or a social circle, has rules designed to protect it. When you understand those rules better than the people who wrote them, you gain the power to turn the entire system against them. 3. The high cost of integrity. The ending was satisfying, but it wasn't happy in the traditional sense. Jaewon won the war, but she lost her anonymity and her simple life. She had to sacrifice her safety and force an innocent man, Jae, into a difficult position to secure the long-term good of the community. The lesson: true justice is rarely free. To dismantle a corrupt power structure, you have to be willing to accept that the person you were before the conflict may not exist when the dust finally settles. The story of the glass cage is closed, but the world of strategic power plays is infinite.